Hello and good afternoon. My name is Glowenche Mensah. I'm a steward of the Outcome Mapping Learning Community and I work in Accra, Ghana. Welcome to our fourth webinar of the series. Before we begin our webinar this afternoon, I wish for us to just go through a few housekeeping details. Please note that this webinar is going to be recorded. All participants will remain muted. We encourage you to please introduce yourself in chat for us to know who you are. Participants will communicate with us through chat, and I'm the host for this webinar. You are free to keep your videos open, but please note that we have close to 50 people participating in this webinar. Before we begin, I must let you know that we have two speakers. They come with a wealth of experience and knowledge on the issue we are going to be treating today. Today on this webinar, we are going to discuss evolving outcome mapping for equity-focused and gender transformative change processes. So we have two very competent people to help us with the webinar today. But just before we go into the main work of the day, just to look at what have we been doing for fun during COVID-19? And you were encouraged to choose multiple answers. I noticed that a lot of us have been cooking. So 50% of us have been doing some cooking. About 48.3% of us have been doing some reading. We have 22.4% of us have been involved in gardening, and I fall in that category. We have 17.2 people being involved in games. We have others that are also involved in art. It's hard to say that very few people have been involved in, we have a lot of people involved in exercises, not as many people involved in Zoom quizzes. And then we have others that were just involved in doing other things that were not listed. Good to know that you are keeping yourself occupied around this period of time. So we begin. I would like to first of all introduce the two speakers for today's webinar. We have, as I said, very experienced and knowledgeable people on board. We have, first of all, we have Heidi Schaffer. Heidi is a steward of the Global Outcome Mapping Learning Community. She is the founder of Advancing Change Together, ACT. ACT facilitates multi-partner collaboration and adaptive strategy development, collective impact, participatory planning, monitoring, evaluation of programs and partnerships aimed at community health and well-being systems. Heidi has a master's degree in education in transformative adult learning and critical global and community issues. She brings over 15 years of experience facilitating equity-focused strategy and performance measurement with organizations in community health and determinants of health. She managed knowledge mobilization, learning and evaluation initiatives with the Ontario Alliance for Healthier Communities from 2010 to 2018. Heidi has facilitated outcome mapping in several continents across the globe. So she's been in Canada, Tanzania, Belgium, Lebanon, Switzerland, Sri Lanka, and Kenya. So there is no doubt that Heidi brings a lot to this webinar. We also have on board as a speaker, Sonia Saveri. Sonia is a member of the outcome mapping community and has written a paper on outcome mapping and gender. Sonia's interests relate to how cultural rights, participation, and gender intersect with various evaluation approaches such as outcome mapping, feminist, utilization focus, and developmental education. She has trained and evaluated using outcome mapping in various contexts and countries. Sonia holds a PhD in social work and is a founder, member, and vice president of the Community of Evaluators South Asia, coordinators of GENSA and Gender Equity Network for South Asia, members of the Gender Evaluation Global Management Group and Evaluation Partner Coordination Committee, and co-member of the South to South Evaluation initiative. She co-designed, co-facilitated the first online gender evaluation course in India. She is an independent consultant and brings over 25 years of experience in evaluation. What more can we ask for? So, ladies and gentlemen, I just want us to welcome both Heidi and Sonia to our webinar. Over to you, Heidi.
Thank you so much, Gwen. And thank you, Sonal, so exciting. And I love the way people are introducing themselves as well as we enter. So I'm going to open up the slides now and start us off in our presentation. So you can see the journey that we are on in involving outcome mapping and equity-focused and gender transformative change. And these are the things that we're going to be covering in the webinar today. We're going to be defining some of the terms, gender, equity, and so on. We're going to talk a little bit about what we heard from the surveys, and also really focus in on some principles and practices and how OM and gender core concepts align, and then look at some examples from both of our practices that we want to share. And essentially we're creating, we hope, a sort of fertile space for a real discussion and dialogue about what next and how we can really strengthen OM to at this particular moment in time. Before I start out, I wanted to just give us a little bit of background and before we go into the terms and the definitions with Sonal. So here's some of the background. In 2017, Sonal led a survey with the outcome mapping learning community, looking at what we found most helpful and challenging, and there is a great report that is available, and I think Simon could probably put the link in the chat for everyone to have a look at this report. There were 25 respondents, and then the next time there were 52, so that just shows how much increase of interest there is. And there were some folks who really had a lot of experience to share. For example, looking at things like progress markers that demonstrate, non-biased change and transformative change. And there were also a lot of people who want to learn more. So there's a deep interest in having more discussion in this area. And then last year, with the launch of the new strategic plan of the outcome mapping learning community, we also launched a survey. And so we're going to be talking a bit about this survey too. I want to just, because I see that there are some people here who may not have a background in outcome mapping, I want to just say that outcome mapping is always been non-proprietary. It's always evolved, and it's always been about evolving. And I think that's why we've been so successful in the outcome mapping learning community of building this long-standing community where people feel ownership and participation. Next year will be our 15th anniversary, because we all have a role to play in adapting outcome mapping and championing and leading outcome mapping. And that's very much always been built into the way outcome mapping has evolved over time. And we're at a particular moment right now where we're really trying to expand our understanding of outcome mapping as a concept, as a way of thinking, as a philosophy, and particularly positioning outcome mapping in this sort of broader, thinking around what are the most sort of innovative and useful methods for complex systemic change and systemic transformation. So this is this survey was the way the stewards decided to start to enter into learning and championing outcome mapping at this time. And we knew that practitioners were using a lot of different methods along with outcome mapping, that they weren't necessarily using it in its original state, the steps, the 12 steps and so on, because it is, next year will be our 20th anniversary. So we also wanted to use this survey to find out how is outcome mapping being used in the field, so we could reflect back about some of the aligned methods and principles that it's being used with. So I'm deeply grateful now to share this presentation with Sonal is a very and for her to help us by starting us off in a good way with with getting our bearings. So I'm going to pass now over to you, Sonal. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Heidi, and thank you for that great introduction. And I think this is a journey that all of us in the outcome mapping learning community want to be on. And this is just the beginning. So before we dive into outcome mapping and gender equity focused evaluations, I just wanted to quickly go through some concepts because we are going to be using them in this presentation. So just to remind ourselves, gender always refers to socially constructed roles and relationships between men and women, and also recognizes other gender identities. You know, we often say gender equal, but equality is always about sameness. So for example, we are all equal in front of the law. And that assumes that if women and men are given the same opportunity, and women are treated similar to men, equality is going to be achieved. But we know that's not the reality. So equity is a concept that gives us a much better understanding of fairness and justice. So because equity will discuss structural and systemic change in power, how do we, for example, facilitate access to services for everybody? That, you know, the no one left behind concept. What are the barriers? So we ask these questions. And gender equity really helps to level a very unequal playing field. In fact, it also forces us to ask very uncomfortable but necessary questions about the differences that we are seeing in our societies. So in this presentation of outcome mapping, we're going to be talking about gender equity. And the next slides, please. And the gender equity is going to force us to be gender responsive in our evaluations. And I'll explain what that means. Because gender in evaluations can be gender blind, they can be gender instrumental, they can be gender ameliorative or gender transformative. And in outcome mapping, we are going to aim for the latter two, because that's where social change actually happens. So gender blind evaluations are, as the name suggests, gender neutral. It's all about overall program effectiveness. And it doesn't really assess if the project or the program has affected men, women, poor men, disabled women, you know, all those differences, have they affected them differently? When you come to gender instrumental evaluations, it accepts the very traditional roles of men and women against their program objectives. So for example, if you begin to target women to improve child health, for example. So this would be an example of a gender instrumental evaluation. So it's not for their own well-being, but it's for something that they do in their role. When we come to gender ameliorative evaluations, that becomes gender sensitive. And it begins to address some of the very specific gender needs of men and women, but it does not address gender relationships that need to be transformed. So an example of that would be, say, assessment of women's access to credit, or how do we strengthen addiction services for men. But it's when we come to gender transformative that we begin to look for changes in power structures. So just to take that example, if you're doing gender ameliorative, you would probably look at better child care for women workers. But if you're looking for gender transformative, you would probably ask and question child responsibilities itself. So we look at the power relationships and structures. So gender transformative is always going to address structural inequalities. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we come to outcome mapping. So the way we have positioned in this presentation, outcome mapping with the gender and equity lens, we are aiming for more gender transformative evaluations. So that always interlocks with other relations. So inclusion, it's not just about numbers, and we know that, But we also must remember that inclusion necessarily means that someone is being excluded. And so historically, exclusion has been linked to gender, caste, if you're in that part of the world, class, age, religion, disability, and so on. But it's also important to ask who includes who, because that also is imbued with power. So when we talk of very meaningful and transparent inclusiveness, we will necessarily talk about intersectionality and all of those different identities of race, class, caste, and all that we talked about. And all of these combine and overlap and intersect. And when we are addressing vulnerable and marginalized people, this really, really becomes critical to address. So in outcome mapping also, we would need to look at both the inclusion as well as particularly intersectionality. So why bother about all this, right, when we think of outcome mapping? But that's because outcome mapping essentially is a gender neutral approach. But when we address gender and equity, as we've just seen, we know that for starters, none of the power relationships are set in stone. They are socially constructed. They can be changed. And it's not just enough that we change people, but we also need to change institutions, social institutions, family, communities, local governments, and so on. So we need to think about systemic change. And the danger is that if we don't address equity and gender in outcome mapping, then as evaluators, we may come to the wrong conclusions. And that could lead to violation of rights. So for example, you may have better agricultural yields, but at the cost perhaps of a triple burden on women, household care plus care work plus economic activities. So we may find that in our evaluations, if we don't address gender and equity, the benefits may exclude some people. So I think the question for all of us, and that's why we are here today, is how do we make outcome mapping more gender and equity oriented? So we went to the community, as Heidi said, in 2017 to find out, and later again in 2019. And Heidi's going to be sharing some of the findings from that survey, and they're amazing findings. And then we will come back and then just talk about some of our initial thinking about the synergies, alignment between gender equity and outcome mapping. So over to you, Heidi, now.
Okay, I thought I had to be unmuted by the host. Thank you so much, Sonal. Thank you. So this is the journey that we're on. This is really a COVID moment. I would say that if anything, at the moment, we've become so acutely aware of inequities and the opportunity that we have, to use outcome mapping and our aligned approaches like outcome harvesting to really advance systemic inclusion, equity, and gender transformation. And I'm really, I live in North America, and here in North America, we're seeing a sea change in terms of actions and support for movements like Indigenous Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter. And I think the moment here that we have is a huge responsibility in our roles as evaluators, as change makers, to really listen very deeply, and to inform ourselves and learn about these frameworks and these concepts. So I'm really excited that Sonal is here to share some of that with us, so that we can really embed and champion out a transformative outcome mapping approach. I wanted to start with kind of a brief reflection about what we heard from the survey. We will be producing a report as well, and then get into some of these, the sort of the main course, which are the principles and frameworks that we can learn from, and then to have a nice discussion together about where do we go forward. So in terms of the survey then, I want to acknowledge and thank the folks did answer. We had 52 people from 35 countries. This is the thing about the outcome mapping learning community that is so unique and so valuable. 35 countries participated. So that's where the interest is. It's really broad. And we had two kind of meetings already, and so there's a bit of an emerging network coming forward, and we are working towards creating some resources for the 20th anniversary of outcome mapping, and we're not exactly sure what those are going to look like yet because we're going to be co-creating them with you and together, so we'll have more on that. So there was a great range of responses in the survey from 0.5 years of experience with OM to 18 years of experience. So on average, 5.6 years of outcome mapping experience. And quite a few people, more than 50% of the people who responded had either often or quite often did design, monitor, or evaluate equity-focused inclusion and or gender transformative programs. And yet this is really telling that even so, the average 2.8 out of 5 was the level of experience that people felt they had related to gender transformative analysis. And this is, you know, the mean, the mode, they were all 3. So this isn't skewed by the sample. This is really that in general, what we're hearing is that there's a real need for more experience, for more confidence, and for more capacity to do this work. I go ahead here to talk a little bit about another piece of the survey, which was where we were asking about, you know, what are the other kinds of tools and aligned approaches that strengthen outcome mapping for equity focus and gender focus. And what we heard and what we saw was there are quite a few tools being used, well, certainly logic models, theory of change, outcome harvesting with outcome mapping, but particularly in the knowing the system level, less so in the assessment of, let's say, health equity impact assessment or gender impact assessment, and much less so in the area of kind of customized tools that are OM specific, so gender biased or gender non-biased, progress markers, and you know, case examples, and you know, sort of guiding principles for the application of outcome mapping. So when we produce the report, we'll have more to share about some of these aligned methods that flow and work to support a transformative OM approach. Now this slide is a bit dramatic, this fork in the road, but I wanted to zoom out for a moment because you know, outcome mapping was developed for highly complex, emergent, and hard to predict change with the International Development Research Center and the research programs, and it really did these 3 very innovative things that we keep talking about as the core concepts in OM, really defining the system, defining the key actors that will be the drivers of change, and then understanding the behavioral changes, the outcomes as the progress markers along this transformative journey. And we, at this moment, as I mentioned earlier, are trying to really broaden our understanding because we are a community not just about a method, but about a way of thinking. And so one of the things that we, as the stewards in particular, and we will be engaging much more with the community on this, started to identify, you know, at its essence, what is outcome mapping now, 20 years later, and how do we identify a set of core concepts that can be useful and support, you know, practice and particularly, I feel this equity and gender transformative practice. So there's a discussion paper that's being developed. Pardon me, discussion paper that's being developed, and it will be coming out in the fall from the stewards, and it does present some of these core concepts. So this is not the definitive list by any means, but these are some that I pulled out of the paper. So participatory, people-centered, and relationship-based is a core concept. Understanding the system and the context. Being actor-centered, having an actor-centered theory of change that's grounded in complexity and systems thinking. And learning-oriented and adaptive. So these are some of the core concepts. And the reason it's important to share these is because they were built into how we approach the survey. So in asking people in the survey, what are the principles that guide your practice of outcome mapping? And then we wanted to look at those principles to see if they could be made useful and particularly guiding for this gender transformative practice. So I'm going to just take one example right now because we have so much to talk about, and that's participatory and people-centered. And I'm going to just share some of the responses from the survey. So these were some of the things that, these are like verbatim responses from the survey. So they're not fully baked principles by any means, but really understanding that leaders and owners of social change processes are among the most vulnerable groups, and really ensuring this participatory involvement, which, you know, a lot of you might say, yeah, no, that's a no-brainer, but we're going to go much deeper into that. Understanding behavior change from the point of view of those the intervention's intending to benefit, and then defining success according to the users and not providers, and being centered on the vulnerable receivers of the services and supports. So this is like the beginning potentially of a set of principles that might support us in looking at these core concepts and practicing these core concepts in this broader sense of outcome mapping as a way of thinking as well as a way of practice. But as I mentioned, they're not strong enough. So we need to go back to Sonal to get some more thought leadership to really, you know, understand what are these frameworks and principles that can guide us. So back to you, Sonal.
Thanks a lot, Heidi. And thank you for laying the foundation of what I'm going to be talking about. So we stated earlier that outcome mapping is really gender neutral. And we also discussed why gender transformative practice is really critical. So the next question would be, well, okay, so what are those gender transformative core concepts that we are looking to align with the outcome mapping core concepts? So I'm just going to present some thinking around that synergy between the two. It's very much a work in progress. And we are really looking forward from the community. And I know lots of people have worked on both of these issues, gender and equity, experts in outcome mapping, to extend work on it. So this is just very much in the beginning stages. So what I'll do is I'll first talk about some of, not all, just some, 6 core concepts of any gender transformative evaluation. So it's always rooted in social justice. And any gender transformative evaluation must address inequities, structural and systemic power differences. So aligned to that is that voices of the most marginalized need to be heard, the no one left behind. And these voices have to come to the table and have an equal space at that table. And we've talked a lot about participation and meaningful participation, which would necessarily be inclusive. So that would be another core concept of gender transformative evaluation. And when we talk about reflective in a gendered evaluation, we talk about the need to adapt, to change course. That change is slow. It's often a process. It's often unpredictable. One of the core concepts of gender transformative evaluation is about knowledge. And we consider knowledge as an extremely powerful resource. That means that we are willing to co-create and share that knowledge, and to use that knowledge for change, to advocate for change. And when we talk of way of thinking, it's about everything. So it's about embracing different perspectives, embracing different worldviews. For example, to be aware of decolonization, of racism, sexism, and so on, and to embrace that way of thinking. Now I'm going to, describing that, look at how do outcome mapping and the gender core concepts align. And again, this is very initial work, and we look forward to your comments. So if you look at the first core concept, knowledge is a powerful resource. In outcome mapping, we create knowledge by, for, with people who are most directly affected. And in gender and equity, as we've seen, it's a resource to be created and shared by all. But we also recognize that some ways of knowing are more privileged over others. So we see some alignment, and we see some places where we need to strengthen our alignment with outcome mapping. The next one is about voices of the most marginalized. Yes, as Heidi mentioned, people-centered, actor-centered, addressing behavior change of boundary partners, involving strategic partners. Yes, we know all of that. But when we talk of gender and equity, we have to focus on changing power relations, and it's focusing on those most affected by power inequality. So it's a slightly different focus that we are looking at. The third concept that I had presented was in participation and inclusion. And yes, we include diverse people in planning for outcome mapping. But in gender and equity, we recognize that all of the voices need to be heard, and especially those that are the most vulnerable and marginalized. So again, a slightly different focus, those that are left behind. The fourth concept that we discussed was on a reflective approach to our evaluation. And in progress markers, there is a process by which we look at, what can we achieve, what we can go further, and what we may love to achieve. So there is a progression of outcomes. And in that sense, gender and equity that looks at empowerment extremely closely also aligns with the process. We know it can't happen overnight. And so that gradient of outcomes is very useful when we think about gender and equity. The next concept is about, the way of thinking. Yes, outcome mapping is extremely adaptive. It responds to contextual needs. And gender equity is also about that, but it recognizes that different realities coexist. So again, it gives them equal space at the table. And the last one on social justice. We concentrate more on whom we can influence. And so we have spheres of control, influence, interest, and so on. But in gender and equity, what we are seeking to do is to influence and change, to have social change, and to address social justice. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we can very practically look at how to operationalize some of this if we are doing outcome mapping, because it goes a bit beyond and discussing with other stakeholders as well. So this is just some ideas from the work that I have done, and very much a work in progress, but I thought it would be interesting to share it today. So for example, if you're looking at boundary partners and we want to have a very clear gender and equity focus, we must recognize that we must include women and marginalized groups, and to specifically recognize intersectionality. We have participatory approaches, we use mixed methods, but we would need to ask who's missing, whose voice is not heard. And we also would need to encourage many ways of knowing. So if you have a non-literate audience, to use PRA methodologies, the mixed methods, and to align our data gathering according to the needs of the people whom we are working with. Our progress markers. Now, because it's a gender neutral approach, we have to select outcomes that address structural inequities. If we don't do that, we are not going to look for social change. And because empowerment is a process, the progress markers really provide us an excellent tool to plot that trajectory of change. And we have to be also very careful for unintended outcomes. This is something that is critical when we address gender inequity. So we have to go beyond the progress markers that we may have established in the beginning. Outcome journals, again, we use that a lot, but we need to recognize that different stories depends on who's writing. And that diversity has to also come from how it's expressed. So stories, pictorials, and so on and so forth. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the vision, mission, and strategy maps. If you don't address gender and equity at that point, you're going to miss it. So we have to be vigilant right from the start that we begin to address the vision, mission, and so on. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about the review and the dialogue and so on. And here I wanted to say is that we need to talk with all our stakeholders, not just our boundary partners, but to have this discussion with strategic partners, and to also understand that these power relationships change. Sorry. Because they're power structures, they may have power imbalance. Sorry. So, so we need to, excuse me, also address the fact that new partners may emerge. Sorry. Do we have the next slide, please? Okay, so I just wanted to have share an example where I used outcome mapping as one of the approaches in evaluating an adolescent boys empowerment program. So this is a program that was empowering males for gender justice and working with more than 3,000 adolescent boys in almost 28 low-income communities in India and Pune. There was an NGO, Equal Community Foundation. They have a website. And they wanted, they called me in to address, what had they achieved and how could I inform their future work. So I used outcome mapping, and it was truly helpful when we started to plot the implicit theory of change. So we had the inputs, the curriculum, the various activities they were doing, workshops, community meetings, and so on and so forth. And when we came to the progress markers, we realized that all of their work was in expect to see and like to see. So the adolescent boys were spreading awareness. They were doing small chores that were considered to be for girls in the households. But when it came to love to see, which was the gender transformative, the challenging of gender and social roles that we talked about, they hadn't done that well. And what was very interesting is that when we started looking at the boundary partners, which were those adolescent boys, and the strategic partners, we realized that the strategic partners had not been addressed, and they became the gatekeepers for change. So when gender roles were being questioned and deeply entrenched attitudes towards male preference and female subordination, these areas were not addressed. And so we needed to recalibrate and look at a better dialogue between strategic boundary partners, those who are in the periphery, in the enabling environment, and so on. So all of these concepts that we are using in outcome mapping are critically important when we are looking at gender and equity. So I know Heidi is going to be also sharing another example about inequity and gender. I also wanted to just say that as evaluators, we need to negotiate terms of reference. Even if we have a gender neutral evaluation terms of reference, we need to advocate to include gender and equity within our terms of reference. And I think it's really important that to have somebody on your team who has some understanding and knowledge of gender analysis. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Heidi for her example.
Thanks so much, Sonal. And while you were speaking, I was also just putting in the chat that, and you and I acknowledged this when we were planning, that this is a big topic. And that what we really, in our ideal world, we would be taking some of the questions that come up today and really facilitating some discussion online with those questions, right? Exactly. So I just have a couple more slides and then we're going to open up to conversation. This slide is one that I've used in the Health Equity Indicators Project, and I can provide a link to that, the training that was part of the Community Health Centres, Access Alliance, and all the community health centres in Ontario. And it points out this idea of equity with empowerment and systemic change, and how you kind of, move. It speaks to this idea of removing systemic barriers. And so the viewers no longer, require support, and then the service providers, in this case it's the baseball players, are able to fully see that their clients. The challenge here is, what do we do when the barriers are, systemic barriers are racism, white supremacy, colonial history, bias, and we really need to disrupt and dismantle systems. How does outcome mapping hold up? And so I just wanted to share a quick example of that. So I have worked with this Indigenous Cultural Safety Program. They're part of the Indigenous Primary Care Council. This is a movement for Indigenous health in Indigenous hands in Ontario. And they do this online training. They've currently trained, I think, tens of thousands of healthcare providers in Ontario. And their training includes things like the history and legacy of residential schools, Aboriginal rights and treaties, Indigenous teachings and practices. They include intercultural competency, they include conflict resolution, and anti-racism. And there's considerable research, Indigenous-led research, that is going on and continues to go on to demonstrate what kinds of results are arising from this training, and in this journey. In addition to this practitioner training, they work in these organizational partnerships, and they're really trying to, improve awareness about colonization and anti-Indigenous racism and how it's embedded in organizational practices at every level. And I'm sharing this brief example because I have permission from the evaluation manager. I was invited to help and work with the Indigenous Cultural Safety Program in 2018 to help develop an outcome-based and learning-oriented monitoring approach to this organizational partnership work. And this kind of work includes consultations to improve healthcare quality. It includes, looking at supporting, high-performing organizational practices that embed cultural safety. These are very large organizations, and there's a big challenge here in terms of being able to, well, first of all, to be able to see this transformative change and measure it on the journey to the longer outcomes of better health and care experience. And I'm not talking about that today. What I am going to talk about is focusing here on how we have to disrupt OM. And what I learned is that we can't use outcome mapping in its original design for this kind of anti-racist work. And so this is really interesting for us as we're building our capacity. That I learned from my Indigenous colleagues that cultural safety can't be mapped, these outcome challenges and progress markers can't be mapped, and largely because of this colonial mindset. And it really requires, these transformative relationships in order to create change. And the change kind of emerges in a holistic way. So for example, out of the training, after completing the training, some people are highly motivated to take action. And in this example, by learning and practicing land acknowledgements, this is, although a small change, it was an immediate action that some people could take and wanted to take after the training. And I want to quote from my Indigenous colleagues here, because land acknowledges might merely seem like, a very small step, but it reminds people about the truth of the lands on which we work and the lasting impact of colonization on Indigenous people living here. The reminder comes just as people are beginning meetings, where decisions are being made. It is possible that these consistent, timely reminders impact how people work and make decisions in ways that sustain the anti-racist learning and propel learning into action. And I just wanted to note this as my last slide to say that really there's a flowing back and forth between outcome harvesting and outcome mapping. So we used outcome harvesting to harvest the progress markers for the boundary partner and with the boundary partner. And once they have these progress markers, they are then able to develop their own outcome challenges with support of these ongoing relationships. So, you can see how there are these really interesting examples of how outcome mapping can be disrupted and used in a way that supports transformative change. So that's, we're getting to the very end, and we wanted to save 20 minutes. We're not quite there, but close. So this was really the question that we wanted to discuss next. I'm going to take my slides off. In addition to your questions about our presentation, we really want to know from you how to strengthen outcome mapping for equity-focused and gender transformative change processes. We're going to create some kind of resource in 2020 for the 20th anniversary. But we also want to hear, from you, and we want to engage you and invite you into this journey. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and we're going to see, Sonal's going to, or Glowen's going to help us to see what are some of the questions emerging, and also what might be, we'll sort of flow between suggestions for building capacity and also questions. Because as I said, we'd like to take these questions onto the OMLC for discussion as well.
Thank you very much, Heidi and Sonal. Very, very interesting presentations you had there. Yes, indeed, Heidi, we do have a few questions, and I just want to encourage participants to please use the chat to type in your answers to the questions that Heidi put up, and then we will see how we can look at some of your answers. But before that, let's just answer a few questions from participants. One question, Heidi, that comes out is, how do you face resistance to deal with gender transformative approach? If you start, normally there's going to be resistance. How do you face resistance?
Sounds like a question for Sonal.
Well, one way is don't call it gender transformative. Some people don't like to hear that word. Many people don't like to hear the word feminist, because that's what gender transformative is. So talk about social change, talk about making sure no one is left behind. So you can talk about some of those concepts around it. And often people don't understand exactly what we mean when we say gender transformative. So that's a fantastic opportunity for you to talk to them about why it's important and how we can go about it. So I wouldn't even use any of the terms that are difficult, and just use what's most comfortable, but get to what we need to do for gender inequity.
Okay, we do have another question that asks how evaluators engaged in transformative work can shift other systems in their organization and, in other larger systems like funding, implementation, and that kind of thing. How can we shift them as we work within our organization, being aware of gender issues? Should I bring the question again?
Yeah.
I think if it's about gender, it's over to you. And if it's about equity, I can take it.
Okay. Well, yes, we can definitely look at all those these other systems that interlock with gender. And there are a number of gender frameworks. So you could use outcome mapping with those frameworks, and that would help to organize some of our thinking around the issues that you've mentioned. I can just say a number of them. One is the change matrix that looks at budgetary and policy related, as well as community social norms, as well as individual empowerment. Then there is the 12-box framework. There are others dealing with social inequality and poverty. So what I'm trying to say is that there are a number of tools and frameworks within the gender transformative evaluation that could be used along with outcome mapping. And when I did the survey in 2017, a number of people were already doing that in order to supplement, and to complement and to add value to outcome mapping. They were using many of the tools that were PRA or related to gender and equity. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Sonal. Heidi, there's one here for you. How do we ensure we are really addressing structural systemic inequities beyond gender? How do we ensure we are really addressing structural systemic inequities beyond gender? Do you have something to say about that, Heidi?
Sure. I mean, I work in in the North American context, and I think the essence of the what I have been learning from my Indigenous colleagues is that the leadership has to come from the people who are experiencing the barriers, the oppression, the racism themselves. That they need to be the ones who are, really supporting this journey. It's not that you cannot see those systemic barriers within a mindset of white supremacy and privilege without having that support. So it really is about power and shifting power to the communities that are most vulnerable, that are going to be able to provide that holistic learning journey, that transformative learning, where you come out of those relationships with that motivation to create change in your own spheres of influence, whatever those might be. And that's, I think, what I was trying to share with that one example. Glo, and I know that there's more questions. I just want to say just quickly remind people that even if we can't address it today, Glo, that Sonal and I are really interested to get your ideas about how we strengthen outcome mapping, and to lead this work, to champion outcome mapping as a transformative change methodology and way of thinking. So
I can just take over. I think Heidi's frame has frozen. But what we were looking for, sorry, Heidi, your frame was frozen. So I am just continuing with the fact we want to understand from the community what are the next steps, and how should we go about it so that we are able to work further on these aspects. And we want ideas from the community. What do you think would work?
Yes, thank you. I live in a rural area. My internet is not very good. Okay, and so are there any other questions?
Yeah.
Glowen?
Yeah, I think, Heidi, there's just one last question that I think is quite interesting. This is a question about above binary inequities. Have any of you got experience in working with that above binary inequities in evaluation and stuff like that? Yeah.
Well, I have done a lot of work because I've done some work in HIV/AIDS, and so we have to address these issues, and it is very important, and it's also very sensitive, and how you approach it, the processes of involvement, inclusion become very important. Also, the dialogue that you have amongst stakeholders, you have to be able to design that well in order to either whether you're doing program planning or if you're looking at evaluating or monitoring your projects. But yes, it can be done.
I just wanted to pick up on one question that I see there that's, I think, really important, and that is this question is about movement work and feminist organizing and leadership. But I think that this is very much where we are right now, is to figure out what are the felt needs in these social justice movements for evaluation, learning, planning, that outcome mapping can then support, and really having that very conversation about are these movements, because using anything, and how can we be most useful. So we need to listen first to what the needs are, and then figure out how we can then use our tools and our experience to really champion and lead this, help these movements in the ways in which we have influence and skills.
Thank you very much. I think we have quite a wealth of interesting questions which we are going to address in either a follow-up session or also on the Outcome Mapping Learning Community platform. So I think I'm interested in proposing the follow-up session to strengthen capacity, addressing questions that will be raised during this presentation. So we will inform everybody about that. I saw a few questions about how do I join the community, and Simon did put a link up. Everyone is open to join the Outcome Mapping Learning Community. We invite you to join. I want to say a big thank you to our panelists, Heidi and Sonia, it's been a great pleasure listening to you and
Thank
you
you.
know, getting insight
you.
into this. I also want to say a big thank you to all participants. It's been good having you for the last 59 minutes. We've come to the end of today's session, and we are going to share both the recordings and the presentation on the Outcome Mapping Learning Community platform. Thank you for joining us, and have a blessed day.
Thank you.
Thank you.